He built the most influential megachurch in American history and sold 50 million books, so why did his own people just show him the door? After 43 years of loyalty, the Southern Baptist Convention didn't just disagree with Rick Warren, they officially cast him out in a move that shocked the religious world. But the official reason given is only half the story. Today, we're looking at what really happened behind closed doors. To understand how we arrived at this historic confrontation, we have to travel back to 1980. Picture a young, ambitious pastor named Rick Warren arriving in the rapidly growing suburbs of Orange County, California. He did not have a church building, a wealthy donor network, or even a single member to start with. All he had was a station wagon, a map of the local area, and his wife, Kay. They rented a modest apartment, and on Easter Sunday of that year, they held the very first service of Saddleback Church in a local high school gymnasium with just a handful of curious residents. From those incredibly humble beginnings, Warren did not just build a local community church. He constructed a global ecclesiastical empire. Over the next 4 decades, Saddleback grew exponentially, eventually welcoming over 20,000 worshipers every single weekend across multiple sprawling campuses. Warren became a household name globally when he published his theological masterpiece, The Purpose-Driven Life, in 2002. That single book became a historic publishing phenomenon, selling over 50 million copies, translated into dozens of foreign languages, and read by everyone from prison inmates to corporate executives. For decades, the Southern Baptist Convention was incredibly proud to claim Warren as their crowning achievement. He was the golden boy of the denomination, and the SBC pointed to Saddleback as the ultimate proof that Southern Baptist theology could dominate modern culture. Beneath this massive success story, a deep ideological fault line was quietly forming. The SBC is not a centralized hierarchy. It is a voluntary association of independent, autonomous churches that choose to cooperate for the sake of missions. Historically, this meant individual churches had immense freedom. But as cultural shifts began to reshape American society, the conservative leadership of the Southern Baptist Convention grew increasingly anxious about maintaining doctrinal purity. They felt a desperate need to draw clear lines in the sand, and the spark that finally lit the fuse was the highly controversial question of who gets to hold the title of pastor. In May of 2021, Saddleback did something that sent shockwaves through the entire evangelical community. They ordained 3 of their longtime female staff members as pastors. This was a direct, open challenge to the Southern Baptist Statement of Faith, which strictly limits the office of pastor to qualified men. But here is the twist that nobody wants to talk about. Is this really just about a disagreement over a few verses in the Bible, or is there a much larger, unspoken panic gripping the Southern Baptist Convention? While the public headlines screamed about women in ministry, behind the scenes, the SBC was facing an existential collapse. They were bleeding millions of members and drowning in a devastating, decades-long sexual abuse cover-up scandal that had just been exposed to the public. In a desperate bid to rally their conservative base, distract from their own massive failures, and project an image of absolute moral authority, did they choose to make an example of their biggest star? We are about to dive into the hidden power struggle that transformed Rick Warren from the SBC's golden boy into their ultimate scapegoat. To truly understand why the SBC moved so aggressively to expel Saddleback, we have to look closely at the political landscape of the denomination. In the years leading up to 2023, a highly organized, ultra-conservative faction known as the Conservative Baptist Network began gaining immense influence. This group argued that the SBC was drifting toward theological liberalism and cultural compromise. They pointed to secular culture, critical race theory, and egalitarian theology as existential threats to the church. For these leaders, Rick Warren's seeker-sensitive model of ministry was always a source of deep suspicion. They believed that Warren's focus on cultural relevance, practical living, and mass appeal came at the expense of hard doctrinal truths. They saw his pragmatism as a dangerous gateway to theological compromise, a dilution of the strict Reformed theology they wanted to enforce across the denomination. At the exact same time, the SBC was reeling from the release of a damning independent investigation by Guidepost Solutions. This report revealed that top denominational leaders had spent decades actively suppressing, downplaying, and ignoring hundreds of credible reports of sexual abuse within SBC churches to protect the institution from legal liability and public embarrassment. The moral credibility of the SBC leadership was completely shattered. They were facing public outrage, declining baptisms, and an unprecedented drop in membership, losing hundreds of thousands of members year after year. The statistics were grim. The denomination had lost nearly 3 million members in less than 20 years. In this climate of absolute chaos and moral failure, the leadership needed a win. They needed to show their deeply concerned, traditionalist base that they were still strong, still holy, and still committed to biblical truth. And what better way to do that than by drawing a hard line on the issue of female pastors? By targeting Saddleback, the SBC leadership could signal to their ultra-conservative base that they were willing to enforce doctrinal purity at any cost, even if it meant cutting ties with their most famous and successful congregation. It was a classic institutional survival tactic: direct the anger outward, find an easy theological target, and unify the ranks by defeating a prominent internal adversary. It allowed them to change the national headline from a devastating abuse scandal to a defense of biblical inerrancy. When the SBC's executive committee officially voted to expel Saddleback in February of 2023, declaring the church not in friendly cooperation, Rick Warren refused to go quietly into the night. He decided to exercise his right to appeal the decision at the annual SBC meeting in New Orleans in June of 2023. This set up one of the most highly anticipated, high-stakes showdowns in modern church history. Warren stood before 13,000 messengers to present his case. He did not apologize, nor did he beg for mercy. Instead, he challenged the theological foundation of their decision. Warren argued that the SBC was violating its own historic principles of sole competency and local church autonomy. He pointed out that the Baptist faith and message was never intended to be a rigid creed that forced complete uniformity on every single point of doctrine. Historically, Baptists had agreed to disagree on non-essential matters while uniting around the essential mission of global evangelism. Furthermore, Warren made a robust, scholarly biblical argument for his position. He challenged the traditional, literalist interpretation of passages like 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, which is often used by complementarians to restrict women from teaching. Warren argued that when you look at the entire sweep of Scripture, God consistently uses women in roles of significant spiritual authority. He pointed to the Great Commission, arguing that the command to go, baptize, and teach was given to all believers, not just men. He reminded the crowd that on the morning of the resurrection, Jesus chose women to be the very first witnesses and the very first preachers of the gospel, sending them to proclaim the news to the male disciples who were hiding in fear. To Warren, restricting women from using their spiritual gifts to teach and lead was not biblical faithfulness. It was a cultural tradition that was actively hindering the growth of the church at a time when Christianity was already in a steep decline. He argued that the church needed all hands on deck to fulfill its mission, and sidelining half of its workforce was a strategic disaster. But the messengers in New Orleans were not swayed by Warren's theological arguments. They voted overwhelmingly, by a margin of nearly 9-1, to uphold the expulsion of Saddleback Church. But Saddleback was not the only casualty of this ideological purge. On that very same day, the SBC also voted to expel Fern Creek Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky, a church that had been led by a female pastor, Allison Fitzgerald, for over 3 decades. This was a much smaller congregation, but their expulsion proved that the leadership was not just targeting megachurches. They were systematically purging any church that dared to deviate from their strict interpretation of pastoral leadership. 3 other churches were also ousted for having women in pastoral roles. Shortly after, other major congregations began to feel the heat. Elevation Church, a massive multi-campus megachurch led by Stephen Furtick in North Carolina, quietly withdrew from the Southern Baptist Convention. They realized that the writing was on the wall. The SBC was no longer a big tent coalition where different ministry styles and secondary theological views could coexist. It had transformed into an exclusive club with strict ideological litmus tests. This created a staggering paradox. The very churches that were growing, attracting young people, and baptizing thousands of new believers were being cast out by a denomination that was rapidly shrinking, aging, and losing its cultural influence. It showed that the institution valued doctrinal conformity far more than numerical growth or cultural impact. The expulsion of Rick Warren and Saddleback Church was much more than just a denominational disagreement over church policy. It was a watershed moment that marked the end of an era for American Christianity. For decades, the evangelical movement was defined by a pragmatic, entrepreneurial spirit that valued growth, innovation, and cultural engagement above all else. Rick Warren was the absolute master of that era. But today, we are witnessing a dramatic shift toward tribalism, where institutions are choosing ideological purity over cooperative mission, even if it means their own decline. As Warren himself noted, this decision will have massive, unintended consequences, potentially alienating thousands of gifted female leaders and accelerating the departure of younger generations from traditional churches. The lines have been drawn, and the future of the church will look radically different. If you want to understand how this massive shift is redefining not just the Southern Baptists, but the entire landscape of modern faith, you need to watch our next video, where we break down the secret collapse of the megachurch model and what is rising from its ashes.